Hi, I'm Karin Zissis with ASCOA Online. Latin America, the biggest source of fresh water in the world, is running dry. With resources ranging from Patagonia's glaciers to the Amazon River, Latin Americans have 300% more per capita water access than the rest of the world. And yet, 150 million people in the region live in water-scarce areas. And as temperatures rise, the effects are being felt across the region. Argentina faced its worst drought in 60 years. Mexico's water security was a major political issue in this year's election. Drought reduced the number of ships passing through the Panama Canal, affecting global trade. And in Brazil, water levels in the Amazon port of Manaus were at their lowest levels since 1902. Water shortages threaten to become a new normal. But there are solutions. In this episode, we'll hear about what the region is facing, as well as ways to respond to Latin America's water crisis.
Drier conditions were predominant, and that implies more and more water insecurity, which some decades ago was something impossible to think in Latin America.
That's Rodney Martinez, the World Meteorological Organization representative for North America, Central America, and the Caribbean. He's a lead author of a report launched this year giving a detailed picture of climate change in the region. And he says governments need to do a better job planning ahead rather than reacting to crises.
There is need to really take opportunity of the information available to make decisions, but to make decisions in advance. And that is another challenge in the region.
Martinez spoke with my colleague Luisa Lemme on what is needed for Latin American countries to get out of emergency mode by, among other things, using seasonal forecasts available months ahead of time. And some of the best solutions, the ones that protect the abundant water Latin America still has, are based on nature itself.
Now, what happens if the glaciers are gone? It's a big problem for the water security, but there is, luckily, the only natural substitute to water security that we are seeing are the hope for natural native ecosystems in the high Andes to actually play some of that role. Some of the high Andean ecosystem, including the polylepis forest, it is one of the highest forests in the world. It has an incredible ability to actually capture water from the air, humidity, and convert it into water through condensation, but also then store it within the root and moss and all the microsystems around it in the altitude.
Florent Kaiser is the CEO of the Global Forest Generation, or Acción Andina, a reforestation project in Peru restoring water sources across the Andes that was recognized by the UN as a model to replicate around the world. He talks about how to engage big stakeholders in the public and private sectors, and he says the money is already there.
The amount of money sitting at governments today available for restoration measures is humongous. It is big. So it is in emergency funds, it is in water tax payments, it is in many other sort of funds that look at infrastructure and still invest in dams and other gray infrastructure, but could have an equally cost-effective way of investing in natural or green infrastructure like trees and forests.
But first, we'll hear from Martinez on how places like Cuenca in Ecuador and Ceará in Brazil offer examples of success. Thank you for being with us. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Latin American Focus at Apple, Spotify, or your platform of choice. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Rodney, thank you so much for being at Latin America in Focus podcast. We really appreciate you here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Latin American countries are really suffering climate-related disasters. Can you talk a little bit about how water fits into this whole climate change, new context that the region is living now?
Yes, thank you, Luisa, for the question. I think it's quite important because everything is connected. We are living a triple planetary crisis, which is related with the biodiversity loss, is connected also with pollution and contamination, and also climate change. We released the climate report for Latin America just 1 month ago, and it's very clear, it's very sustained signal of increasing temperature, not just in the continent. We have experienced persistent marine heat waves, which also demonstrated that the ocean is not capable anymore to retain and to absorb all the heat that is in the atmosphere, and that has consequences also. When we talk about this, warming conditions, in addition, deforestation and these land use changes, degradation of soils, we have the perfect combination to affect the water availability. So yes, our region has plenty of water. The reservoir are the biggest in the world, but that doesn't mean that we could not suffer of hydric stress and indeed suffering of the water scarcity in many cities in the last years.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we have problems with the hydropower offer in several countries in Central America, Costa Rica, Ecuador. We are also experiencing wildfires that destroy the soils, that destroy many forests, in addition to the recurrent trends because of deforestation. When we saw the panorama of the rainfall anomalies in the region last year, with El Nino happening, the predominance is in drought. So we have more and more drier conditions and drought zones with persistent droughts like Chile, for example. Most part of Brazil and the southern South America was also affected by droughts. Central America was no exception. So drier conditions were predominant. And that implies more and more water insecurity, which is, some decades ago was something impossible to think in Latin America. But we have also to mention there is need to really take opportunity of the information available to make decisions, but to make decisions in advance. And that is another challenge in the region. The governance of all this situation is not necessarily responding to the advances of science, is not responding to the abundant information which is available. El Nino was announced on July last year. Everybody was talking about El Nino, and the Met services, the regional centers, the global centers provided the necessary information to make decisions. But despite of that, we had problems with the management of the water resources in several countries. So there are many elements related with management, integrated management of the water resources for drier conditions, for drought conditions, but also for when we have extreme events for floods.
Can you explain to me a little bit about water management itself? What are the main problems with water management in Latin America today?
So in the national frameworks, each institution plays a role. They need to be articulated, coordinated, exchanging information, and at the time to respond, plan in advance. So that is the main challenge in our region. The WMO members, our Met services, is they are delivering the information. They are providing the information in the best way as possible. And I have to say that I have been working on this almost 30 years. And we have plenty of technological, scientific resources to really provide better information than in the past. Of course, surprises happens.
Mm-hmm.
What happened in Brazil some weeks ago?
With the flood in Rio Grande do Sul.
This extreme rainfall was really a surprise, was very difficult to predict. But there are many other factors that can really be reflected on. How we are dealing with the land management, how we are dealing with water, reservoirs, water availability, how we are dealing with the risk areas and how we can put the attention to these risky areas when normally the most vulnerable people is settled because they don't have any other place to go. As UN system, we are trying to promote this concept of risk management, and that applies also to the water. We are able now to produce a seasonal forecast 3 months in advance, in some cases 6 months in advance, or 9 months in advance. We can talk about what could happen with El Nino or La Nina with some uncertainty. But in the end, that provides more time for decision makers to act. And for that, we need also a strong governance for water. Of course, if I have some information in advance, I need to decide how water needs to be stored, how water needs to be reserved for the crisis, etc. And of course, to promulgate guidelines to the citizens about the use of water for rationalization, etc. The problem is the emergency mode, when we act only when we have the event happening or after it happened. And that is something that is still difficult to change in Latin America region. And also we have another factor, which is the fake news. You know, in this world with the social media and with these communications in real time, scientific news, scientific information, authoritative information from the official sources is not taking account sometimes. And we are competing with a lot of fake news. A lot of fake news that are happening with a frequency that we cannot fight. So it's very sad sometimes to listen to authorities making references to something that they receive by TikTok or other thing made by someone who is not accountable for what they are saying. And that is competing with an official message or recommendation, the result of a lot of effort of technicians, experts, scientists, and the investment of countries in infrastructure to observe the atmosphere, the ocean, etc., and produce this information. I think that's globally happening, but in our case in Latin America, that's one of the, I think, structural reasons that are added to this problem.
You're talking about water management and making those decisions ahead of time. What kind of infrastructure or investment, long term investment, we are needing? For example, countries in Central America that rely on our hydropower, like you said, or even, countries like Chile and Argentina that had drought.
Well, the response is quite complex and depends on the geographic context. To preserve the ecosystems is not a romantic view of the ecosystems. It's not because the nature is great. Yes, it's great, it's beautiful, but it's a technical part. It's a part of an essential component of the hydrological cycle. What happens in the Amazonia, changing the tropical rainforest, the jungle, big trees, with pastures for cattle, that is just killing the functionality of the land, of the soil, in order to regulate the hydrological cycle. And that deforestation is affecting all the capacity of the continent to retain water and keep this water in the continent. What is happening is this water is running away to the oceans, and we have more rainfall in the oceans and not in the continents. And this is the reason why droughts are getting more and more persistent. And we have another problem with underground water. In some countries, they cannot depend on the ecosystems anymore because the ecosystems were just disappear. In Mexico, for example, north of Mexico, they depend completely of the underground water. But what happens with the underground water when the lack of environmental management in some cities can contaminate the underground water? So that could lead to severe water security matters. All this implies a strong institutional coordination.
Do we have good examples in Latin America of countries that actually know how to manage their water reservoirs or are preserving their ecosystems?
Yeah, I have many examples. I think, for example, Chile because they know about their conditions, because the mega drought, they have a very solid water management scheme. So all the scheme that they have with the users and the community and the water supply companies is really a good model. There is a very particular case in Ecuador. Ecuador is rich in an Andean ecosystem, which is crucial for the hydrological cycle, which is called paramos. And there is a complete basin there in Cuenca. Iguan is the third city in Ecuador, which has the best water management supply chain in the country. And it's based on integrated management. So they take care of the ecosystems, they take care of the paramos, quality control of the water. So trying to ensure that all the cycle is protected and they have a very good provision of water for a city. And in the case of Ceará, for example, in Brazil, they have one of the best systems for drought management in the region, and it's a reference in the world.
Why?
Because since many years ago, they have implemented sophisticated systems, integrated science, integrating the institutions to really understand the drought phenomena. And based on that, they have a drought monitor. And based on the drought monitor, because it's very solid, they made decisions.
What are the clear bets? Where do you see really the opportunities for countries and even for the private sector to expand this early warning system for all, get out of this emergency mode that the region is in, as you said?
The early warning systems, services, of course, and the climate services. Climate services for agriculture, water resources, climate services for health, climate services for transportation. What is climate services mean? When we provide climate services, we are forecasting or giving information not just for one day or for tomorrow. We're just giving information in advance, 2, 3, 4, 6 months in advance, because the time scale allow us to understand and to at least to provide some guidance. But we need these climate services be used by the stakeholders, by the sectors. So that means that we need to work more in the interface between them. Private sector is is a key player, and we really need to consolidate the user interface. And that happens also with the support of the government, with the initiative and the pioneering of the private sector, which is happening in Europe, it's happening in other regions. But we need to change this traditional relationship with the private sector in Latin America. It's just not suppliers and customers. Is something different, but in the end, it's a win-win scheme. It's time to evolve in different ways to conduct business. And there are many opportunities ahead because when we have successful schemes of frameworks for this cooperation, the results are really visible. And the impact of this innovation in the most vulnerable are also very visible. There are many examples in the region when this is happening, and we need to really keep going. So the political decision is definitely the essential element that could make the difference in Latin America.
We are talking about ecosystems and El Nino and the temperature of entire oceans. Sometimes the impression is that this issue is just too big to tackle. You're telling me the risk management is the way to look into this. How do we bring this down to people's realities?
Well, I think based on the experience and what we have seen in many places, small efforts and simple solutions could be transformative. And we can really find the way to cope with the new normal. I think simple solutions can be possible to make changes and to really continue with sustainable development under the new rules.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rodney.
Thank you.
In a world of new rules, old tools can be used to restore water sources in the Andes. Florent Kaiser, the CEO of Global Forest Generation, talked with Luis Aleme about how reforestation is bringing water back to the driest areas of the Andes.
My name is Florent Kaiser. I'm a forestry engineer by training, but mostly I would say an entrepreneur for conservation or restoration of earth in general. I moved to Peru over 10 years ago. I got to know an extraordinary person called Constantino Auca. He is an indigenous leader from Peru in the high Andes and around the Cusco region. Tino had invited me to join one of his reforestation festivals. He called them Keonia Raimi in the local language. It really changed my life. Over 1,000 people coming from all sorts of the area to join into a huge reforestation day. And we planted 100,000 trees in 1 day and a half. And I asked Tino that same day, what's next for you? Tino opened up that he wanted to take the model he had developed for this particular region all across the country in Peru and potentially all across the Andes. I'm not gonna lie, I basically left everything else standing. The reason I said Tino is extraordinary as a leader is he understood two very important things. He understood forests can be brought back. He found that within his own cultures, the indigenous high Andean cultures of people, basically the Inca descendants, there were some ancestral principles that stand for as much as reciprocity and communal service. And that allowed the Inca back then to actually gather thousands of people to do great works like building a fortress, building aqueducts, building all sorts of things. And his, I would say, master innovation or master trick here was to revive that, to actually bring people together to reforest and protect forest. If we could help him to replicate that approach across the Andes and then provide the support system to actually enable communities and leaders like Tino everywhere across the Andes, in every watershed, to make a difference and bring the forest back, we had a chance to actually bring those forests back. And we really started small, and it is now growing into a massive project with tens of thousands of people involved. We've planted over 10 million trees.
What was the state of water security for these areas, for the water sources there? And how did all the 10 million trees have been helping to tackle this situation?
The South American continent holds 70% of the tropical glaciers worldwide. And they're melting due to climate change. They're melting very, very fast. I don't know if you saw in the news, but very recently we said goodbye to the last Venezuelan glacier of the continent. This is going to continue with Ecuador, Bolivia, pretty soon, Colombia, and potentially in the next few decades, also Peru. The glaciers play a super important role. This is not only providing water to major cities like Bogota, Lima, Quito, but also acting as a buffer system for the greater Amazon basin, right? So the Andes are an integral part of the Amazon basin, and we tend to forget that. We see the forest downstream and we see the Andes as a majestic mountain range, but it's all interconnected. If the glaciers are melting and communities are getting really, really worried because they're seeing a change, drastic change, even within 20, 30 years, even within a decade, into how much water is available. It's either water is coming too fast, glaciers melting, bringing lots of water down, extreme weather events and landslides and all of the above, or there is extended drought periods. And we're seeing a lot of communities experiencing several more months already of dry weather, changing completely agricultural patterns, species that actually work, leading to food insecurity, health issues, out migration from these traditional lands that were inhabited, basically a drastic disruption in their life system. Now, what happens if the glaciers are gone? It's a big problem for the water security, but there is luckily the only natural substitute to water security that we are seeing are the hope for natural native ecosystems in the high Andes to actually play some of that role. Some of the high Andean ecosystem, including the polylepis forest, it is one of the highest forests in the world. It has an incredible ability to actually capture water from the air, humidity, and convert it into water through condensation, but also then store it within the root and moss and all the microsystems around it in the altitudes. Over time, these forests build wetlands and peatlands, and they can store not only humongous amounts of water, but also carbon and many other really important habitats for biodiversity. Today, there's only 2 to 10% of high Andean ecosystem, specifically polylepis forest, left. And they
Thank you.
play such an important role. And a big part of Acción Andina, a big part of the mission is to actually bring them back and preserve that. That's the whole idea behind the project. Will take decades, if not centuries. The area is humongous. This is 7 countries. These are millions and millions of hectares that need to be restored in order to really do an impact on water security. There is no alternative. That is the big point. It is becoming super important that the governments realize that. And we know in Latin America, there is a lot of problems, ineffective, governance, high bureaucracy, but as well as the private sector. The private sector, let us remind that water is the engine behind every economy, or at least one of the strongest engine behind every economy and even society, right? It is no water, you don't have life, you don't have an economy, you don't have happy people and healthy people. And thus, it is becoming a huge investment priority for the entire region, whether it's the private sector, whether it's the public sector. I live in Lima. You see this every day, right? And Lima is a desert city. If we run out of the water that flows from the top of the Andes, I don't know what happens to 10 to 12 million people.
You ended just now about talking the opportunities with the private sector, the change in behavior of governments. Is it easier to sell this idea when you talk about water than when you talk about reforestation?
It's a great question. Honestly, whether it's whether one or the other is easier, I don't think it really matters. The point is, both are interconnected and super important. So it is easy to explain why reforestation has a water impact. And that is ultimately what convinces people. They're looking for the impact. What we're selling is an opportunity that we can, through relatively cost-effective measures, counter the humongous or astonishing challenge that is coming at us in the next decade, right? And the communities on board, the community are motivated. They see, basically, it's their future. There's a huge underlying opportunity here. It's demonstrating that there is a way forward, that we can do something about it, that we can invest in it, and that it is cost effective to actually do so. So that is the idea we have to sell. But what we need to sell in a broader sense, or make people clear about, is there is a drastic crisis coming at us very rapidly. There are solutions out there. There is an opportunity to actually invest, right, into effective measures. And there is an urgency to do so to prevent drastic loss of social, welfare, well-being, and economic opportunity. And so when we talk about this, there is actually a strong selling argument, despite the fact that today there's no real market for it. But that is exactly what we need to do. We need to work across every sector. We need to bring everybody at the same table and see how we look at climate change, not only with a carbon lens, but with a holistic lens.
That's super interesting. How have you been engaging the opportunities here and now for private sectors, for governments to actually get involved? And how do you talk about this impact now?
We're not looking at making money. We're not looking at maximizing carbon markets. We're actually resolving the needs of people. We traveled to Ecuador it was September 2022, so almost 2 years ago. And the communities explained to us, 10 years ago, we had unlimited water for irrigation. We're here at communities that are relatively high up in the Andes, almost at the agricultural limit. Today, only 10 years later, we are down to 2 hours per family per week, right?
Wow.
Not per day, per week. And you can only start extrapolating the impact it has on production and social well-being and economic opportunities within those communities. So we went up the hills where Acción Andina implements projects with the communities, and it was a year or a year and a half old reforestation. And all of a sudden, we crossed the ridge, and there was a very relatively small lake forming
Mhm.
with 5 by 5 meters and so several cubic meters of water. And the community were like, wow, look, the water is coming back, the water is coming back, what is happening here? This was not here for over 20 years. And obviously the trees had no impact whatsoever as of yet. However, not only by planting the trees are you putting holes that actually help with infiltration into the soil, but we also have protective measures where you fence out a fresh reforestation site, and the cattle
Mm.
and is staying out.
You mentioned briefly about the difficulties in Latin America, in South America with governments. Latin America is still on emergency mode when it comes to climate disasters and when it comes to water management. In your opinion, looking at this work on the ground that you're doing, how do you think that Latin American governments can get more involved, how they can get out of emergency mode?
I was a strong advocate in the project from day one to actually work with the government from day one for the project. I got heavy pushback by our local partners and leaders. And why? Obviously, very understandably, they had 30 years of frustrating relationships. And we then, in our collective approach to designing this project, we settled on one thing. Okay, we're not engaging with governments in the first 5 years. However, there will be a time where we have sufficient runway, where we have sufficient recognition and gravitas, where we can actually come at the table, at a very different table, and have a very different argument. Fast forward 5-6 years, we have major
Mhm.
recognitions. We have recognition at the UN, and specifically the recognition as a world restoration flagship by the United Nations gives us, it is not only a recognition for the program, it is a recognition that goes directly to the region. It is a flagship initiative by all the countries. And so now that gives us a tool to knock on the door and say, you are already part of this, let's work together. If we are truly serious with the mission of contributing to water security in South America, at the end of the day, we are restoring a public good. That means that at the
Mhm.
end of the day, the governments, through all their mechanisms and taxes and policies, need to actually invest in this. The same we need to do with the private sector. We need to show that it is not just a philanthropic, no, it is a massive and smart and cost-effective investment into the long-term sustainability of your business. I think that's where we need a lot of support and where there are opportunities. Can we find the right leaders? Maybe some of them are not even yet in office. Maybe some of them are not even born yet. But can we invest in the
Mhm.
right leaders that understand the challenges, can actually support that mission and become heroes within the government to actually make the case for it at the government level and change policies, investments, programs, public incentives, and so on, so that money can actually reach the ground.
How are you financing? Is it possible to finance this initiative that you're talking about at this scale?
Look, the funding available globally for restoration of ecosystem, when you traditionally look at philanthropy and some rich developed countries investment into that, is very limited. The amount of money sitting at governments today available for restoration measures is humongous. It is big. It is just not specifically mentioning restoration or specifically targeted for nature-based solutions, but it is there. So it is in emergency funds. It is in tax, water tax payments. It is in many other sort of funds that look at infrastructure and still invest in dams and other gray infrastructure, but could have an equally cost-effective way of investing in natural or green infrastructure like trees and forests. And so the money is here, and that's the big point I want to make here. The money is here. We now need to back engineer the policy environment to actually enable leadership to facilitate investments into that. And there, I still think there is an international role to play. We have to facilitate that process. There is many clear examples that this can actually work.
If you could design a public sector partner, or if you could design a governor in the Andes right now that would be the perfect partner or the good partner for you to scale this project and to have this bigger impact and this water security in the future, how would it look like?
It's a great question. In the age of AI and robots and so on, we'll soon be designing, but that's not the point. I think a person who has seen the impact directly. So a person probably living in the Andes and who has seen glaciers vanish and disappear and understood the relationship to water. Second, I would say a person that is more than a politician and great at public speaking, that is an entrepreneur and can say, okay, there's a challenge, but hey, we have solutions and we can do something about it. Third, someone with enough strength and show the leadership needed at all levels to actually break through the heavy apparatus that is quite often so ineffective and so against this person that even if you have the greatest idea, it's really difficult to make real change. And then I would say the other requirement is people that are able to look at holistic or systems thinking. We don't need many people that are knowledgeable now about carbon and say carbon is all what we should care about. We need people who are able to listen to their local communities. We need people to understand the water, and we need people who understand the impact on the economy, socially and culturally, and being able to translate a local community's risk and need all the way up through society to a private sector, like a big bank or another big companies.
Thank you so much, Florent.
Thank you, Luisa. Great chatting with you.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Karin Zissis. This episode was produced by our executive producer, Luisa Lemmy, and associate producer, Fabrizio Ricalde. The music in this podcast was performed by Tigana Santana for America Society. You can catch this concert and others on our YouTube channel. Find out about upcoming concerts at musicoftheamericas.org. Access other episodes of Latin America in Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast. And send us feedback at latamfocus@as-coa.org. Share and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. Thank you.